And we are going to get started with the amazing presentations and just tips and awesome co-hosts that we have tonight.
Can you hear me? My name is Anh, and I've been fly fishing for about 2 years now. Mainly out on the mountains. In the summer, I go up to the high alpine lakes and catch cutthroats. But then, Colorado is all year round fly fishing because of the tailwater. So I do a lot of winter fly fishing as well, and which is really cold. Hand warmers are my best friends. And brutal, but you learn a lot.
And Jenn?
Hi, I'm Jenn Shaw. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, originally from Alabama, actually. And I also have been fly fishing for about 2 years. We're also blessed here in Minnesota to have a wide range of species that we can fish for. The Southeast Minnesota has beautiful trout, and it's it's open year-round fishery, so we can fish in the spring as well as the winter time. In the summer, I actually do a lot of warm water fishing, so bass, pike, and the ever elusive muskie. Carp is also one of my favorite targets to fish for. And I'm really excited to meet everyone and share a little bit of knowledge.
And one thing about Jenn too is she's also graciously is going to be co-hosting an August meeting as well, because that'll be on warm water fishing tips as well. So Jenn, thank you, much appreciated.
My pleasure.
And Jackie, our next co-host.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jackie, and I am currently in Cooper Landing, Alaska, which is on the Kenai River. It's a very popular destination for fly fishing for rainbow trout. I grew up in Wisconsin, but came up to Alaska 12 years ago just to visit for 2 weeks and fell in love with it and never left. So I'm still here. And about 5 years ago now, I started a fishing guide service on the Kenai. So I do that now. And in February, I actually started a group on Instagram called Alaska Women on the Fly, just to try to unite all of the awesome lady anglers we have in Alaska. So yeah, it's nice to be here and meet all you guys, see all you guys. I know I've interacted on Instagram with quite a few of you on a daily basis, it seems like. So it's nice to see everybody here.
Let's see. So with a stealth approach, first of all, when you approach the water, first thing is you gotta look around, be observant, and do not walk right to the water. That's the one common mistake that I did when I first started. Just get so excited with the fly rod, got everything ready, just walk to the water, put it down, and of course that terrifying sight of all the fish fleeing away, you're done. You just go home at that point. So for me, I just have to watch around myself. Where would the fish be? So Heather, if you don't mind, click to the next slide. Okay, so for me, the three things that I would pay attention right away is that what sort of coverage do the fish have? The trees, the bank, the grass, the boulder, the current. And then where's the oxygen? The fish like to hang out where the oxygen is, because just like us, it needs to breathe. So if you can detect where the oxygen is, you know where the fish are, and don't walk right to it. So approach from the behind, but we'll talk more about that. And then what's available food supply? By looking around, you see things are flying, so dry fly is going to be on. If you don't see anything because it's cold, lift up a rock, see what kind of bugs they have, larvae, stonefly, and midges. So it all depends on the condition at that moment too, how cloudy it is. So if it's really dark and cloudy, then the fish doesn't need to hide as much. But if it's sunny, then they're probably hiding away from, underneath the bank or the trees, branches, logs. First of all, observe what's going on around you. Don't just walk right to the water. And then, so for the observation, now we're gonna lead to, as the water comes to view, like I mentioned, just have to study it, look for it. And the trout, sometimes I go right to the water, look around, don't think I see any fish, and then I walk right to it. And of course, the 22-inch trout just kind of fleed away. So just when you think you don't see any fish, they're there because they're well hidden. It's just, got blessed with their camouflage ability. And then if you don't see anything on the surface because they're not feeding on the surface, that means, they're probably not on right now. The temperatures have changed, but they're there. So look for a deeper section where the drop off is, where the current bring it down, and that's where they're hiding. Sometimes they're in the bottom of the water as well. For me, when I come to the water, I stop talking to my friends. Sometimes people think, why don't I talk? Well, a lot of time I'm just in the back of my head, I know the trout can hear me, so I tend to whisper a lot. Sometimes I just turn my volume down. If I have a great conversation with my friends, we're about to set things up. I'm starting to set it up far away. Every steps that I make, whether on the side of the bank, whether into the water, I know right away. They can hear me, they can sense the vibration. And that's also important when it comes down to stealth, because you don't want to spook them with the crunch underneath your feet, your shoes, the rock, the splash. So all of that comes to consideration of being stealth. If you can avoid wading, do so, because in the summer the water is low. When you wade into the water, that creates disturbance, and especially in still water situation too. If you're pocket fishing, the ripple is not too silent, so it's okay, it's more forgiving. But if you're fishing the high alpine lakes or the low water streams, try to avoid wading if you can. Get low. So, as we all know, trout are very tuned into things, what's going on within the field of vision that's in front and above them. Being able to stay low and get into the position where you can cast to feeding trout can make a big difference. I usually approach from the behind, knowing that I'm about to come up to a pocket or a good run. I always start from the back for the downstream first, making my way upstream. That's how I can avoid walking right into them. And then I would crouch down on my knees, or sometimes I just crawl. And then sometimes I would just hide behind a bush, which is very challenging because you can cast right into the tree or the bush. But all of that will help in the future once you advance yourself, get more comfortable. But using those objects will advance the ability to catch more fish. I promise you that. So for me, get low. Just when you think they can't see you, that rod tip, they see that shadow, they will run away. A trout with a deep cut bank available may lie under cover, waiting for a mule to drift by. So for me, in slow moving or still water that are shallower and have less structure, a trout will feel or see you approaching more easily from afar. Therefore, get low. In streams where the water alternates between fast riffle followed by long glides. Your approach should be slow and stealthy as well. Unlike pocket water, where your approach is more hidden and more forgiving by the turbulent seams, where the fish lie, the water surface is smooth without distortion. Oh yeah, if you hear strange noises in the background, that's the goat. My neighbor has goats, so it's okay. So next topic, take cover. Take advantage of anything around you, like willows, shrub, trees, bushes, because all of that will help you camouflage and blend in as well. In the wide open situation, you may need to stay farther back from the banks, keep very low, or make longer casts. Low light days is always your advantage. So you don't have to, be so, I mean, low light is, we all know that's in our advantage. But when it's sunny and bright, like high noon, then you may want to consider stay far away because they will see you. And when that, let's talk about casting. I mean, I'm not gonna go deep into casting, but in a situation where they can see you, I would avoid back casting. I would do a lot more of the roll casting, something that's lighter landing, because when you back cast and it go forward, it tend to land a little bit more violent. So with a roll cast, it lands a little bit more gentle. It lays down a lot more quietly.
And there's one question, which is actually a pretty good one, is like when you're getting low or you're crawling on your hands or your knees, do you, you don't use any knee pads or anything, do you?
Well, to my advantage, I don't have any knee problem, but I know some people have injuries, whether from skiing or just have knee injuries. I would recommend bring a jacket and then use that jacket and put it down to the ground. Sometimes the sticks has spikes. There's some crazy plants out there that has crazy thorn, and so an extra jacket is extra padding, or pants that has extra padding for the knees would be in your advantage. But for me, I'm sometimes I wear my waders, so that's that's not a problem for me. I bring rain jacket and I put it down to help with the crazy rocks and spiky plants, so that would help too.
Thank you. So once again, I'm Jenn Shaw, and I'm going to be talking about nymphing with a strike indicator, which I think is a really effective way to catch trout, since we all know that trout spend most of their time underneath the surface eating little nymphs that come off the ground, scuds and leeches, the vast majority of time. And as cool as it is to see topwater hits, that is not going to be the vast majority of time if you want to catch trout. So learning to be an effective trout angler by nymphing definitely will improve your effectiveness in catching trout. And a strike indicator, I think, is probably one of the most effective ways to nymph. And so one of the things that I remember when I first started fly fishing, you would hear this rule with a strike indicator: you should set it 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the water that you're fishing. So for instance, in this slide, if the water depth is approximately 3 feet from the surface to the bottom, you would want to set your indicator about 4.5 to 6 feet above your last fly. I'll go to the next slide, Heather. But that is a very simplified way to look at things. And there's a couple of things that I remember when I was doing this that didn't make sense to me when I was hearing about that rule was, well, how do you know how deep your water is. And if you don't know how deep your water is, then how are you going to set your indicator? And there are a lot of factors that you do have to take into play or consideration when you are thinking about setting your depth. So I break it down to kind of just 3 simple things. There's obviously way more complicated ways to do this, but I like to keep it simple. So I look at how fast the water is moving. I am going to consider how much weight I want to fish. So whether that is the weight on the fly with a bead head or a tungsten bead head, or if you're using split shot, and then my best guess of what the water depth is going to be. And I'm going to let you know right now, I am a terrible estimator. I have 2 eyes, but I only see in monocular vision. I have terrible depth perception. So I try to keep things as systematic as possible. So when I'm thinking about the weight of the fly that I'm using, if the water speed is relatively fast moving, I'm going to want to use heavier flies or heavier split shot or more split shot. If the water speed is moving slower, I'm going to want to use lighter flies and lighter split shot. And that's because obviously the slower water speed is going to give your nymphs a little bit more time to get to depth than something that's moving super fast. And also, if the water speed is moving slower, that usually means the water is still. And just as Anh had mentioned before, when the water is still, the fish can see you a little better. So if you're plopping something down super heavy and it's making a ton of ripples on the surface, the fish may spook away because of that. So lighter flies, lighter weight will tend to give you a little bit of a softer presentation. So once I've come up to this piece of water that I want to fish, say I've never been there before, or the water is stained and I have no idea what the depth is because I can't see the bottom, or it's rained and now the depth has changed. I'm just going to make a best guess. And that can just literally be if I stand on the edge and it's to my shin, I'm going to guess that the water that I want to fish is probably going to be a little bit deeper than that. So if I feel the water depth is 4 feet, I'm going to pick a length from where my nymph is to where my indicator is. I'm going to try to do this right here. So here's my nymph right here, and then here's my indicator. I'm going to pick it a little bit shorter than what I actually think the depth is. So if I think the depth is 4 feet, I'll actually hedge it and start at 3 feet to be safe, because nobody wants to make their first cast and then snag and lose all their flies. That's the worst way to start. And so I will pick something that I think is just a little shorter than what I actually am guessing the depth to be. And I'll make about 3 or 4 casts out there. And if I don't get a bite or hook a fish, or if I don't see it tick bottom, so with strike indicators, you'll kind of know you're ticking bottom if you kind of see it bounce like this a little bit. Or if I literally get snagged, then I'll know I hit the bottom. And if I do that and I haven't gotten any indication that I'm close to the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and just move my strike indicator up 3 to 6 inches. So I'll go a little bit deeper. And I'm going to repeat this cycle. I'll throw it out, make 3 to 4 casts, and I will keep just going deeper and deeper incrementally on my strike indicator until I tick bottom or until I catch a fish. And then hopefully I catch a fish first before I hit the bottom, and then I will just keep it at that depth and keep fishing until I run out of fish. So let's say you do all of that and then you never tick bottom, or you never catch a fish. Then what's probably happening is that potentially your rig is too light. So if this is at the surface and the rig is your nymph is down here, and it's just floating along and it's above the fish, then it's too light sometimes. And so I will consider putting more weight on my line or my rig, especially if I see that my strike indicator is moving at the same speed or faster than the surface current. So basically, once you throw out your strike indicator, I'll pick a little white foamy thing or something on the surface to give it a relative distance. And if my indicator is moving at the same speed or faster than my foam spot, then I know that my nymph has not actually gotten to the bottom or to the proper depth. It's still riding a little too high or too close to the surface.
I'll go up there. Come on up. You guys look great.
All right. And so the reason why that is that it's about hydraulics. So the bottom of a stream or river is going to move slower than the surface. And that's because there's rocks and substrate on this bottom that actually slows down the current. So that's one thing I always keep in mind, is that the bottom is going to move a little slower. So I want to actually see my strike indicator actually start moving slower than the surface current. And then that gives me a sense of I'm getting close to the bottom where the fish or the trout typically reside. And so this may take me anywhere between 10 minutes to 30 minutes to figure out where I need to be and how much weight I need to be using. And I think the biggest thing that I learned was don't be afraid or reluctant to make changes in either the weight or the depth of your rig. I think it's very easy to kind of just get stuck doing the same thing over and over. And if you haven't caught or haven't done any, or things haven't changed in 10 minutes, you should definitely make a change, whether that's the weight or the depth, or you can change both. So don't be afraid to do that. I'll go to the next slide. So when we say fishing subsurface, we typically mean a nymph, and that basically is representing the immature stage of any aquatic insect. And like I said, that fly that you choose can be an unweighted fly, in which case you'll want to use some split shot to help get your nymph down, or it can be a weighted fly with either a brass head or a tungsten head. I personally fish almost all tungsten headed nymphs because I'm a little lazy. Putting split shot on and off is extra work for me. And it's easier and faster for me to change my nymph to something with a little bit bigger bead head than it is to put split shot on and off. All right. So this next section, I'm going to talk about something that's maybe a little bit more, I would say, intermediate in terms of rigging up. So when I first started fly fishing, even when I was using a strike indicator, I would typically use a tapered leader that we typically find, just a 9-foot tapered leader. This one is a 4X. But recently I've been experimenting with what I call a level leader. And what a level leader means is that piece of monofilament, whether it's fluorocarbon or nylon, basically the tippet section below the indicator, so this section right here, kind of right here, is basically level or the same diameter. And the advantage of that is that something that has the same diameter or level tippet will sink at the same rate along its entire length, whereas a tapered leader is going to actually sink slower because it's thicker at one section and then it goes thinner. So it has greater diameter and thicker tippet at one area, which will then be more influenced by the current, and it will also create drag. So I think this is an example. So the advantage of using a level leader such as this is that, one, it will get your fly down to depth at a quicker rate than a tapered leader. And so if you're fishing fast water or any water, getting your fly down into the strike zone the fastest will give you a longer drift and more chances to catch trout. The second reason I like a level leader is depending on the strike indicator that you're using. So I typically use a New Zealand strike indicator or a kind of a cork style indicator that has a little loop there that you put the tippet through. And so it slides when I want to make adjustments to it like that. And a level leader will allow your indicator, if you're using this style, to actually slide much faster, and it doesn't put kinks in your line or that light wavy things that tend to happen. And I don't know if anyone's also used a tapered leader and they're on the thin section and they've been tossing it around and suddenly they had it set at 3 feet and then suddenly it's down like 2 feet away from the fly and you're wondering, why did my indicator move? It's because if it's along the thinner section, it doesn't have as much grab on the little loop here. So a level leader actually allows my indicator to stay in place and it slides more easily, which means it's just easier for me and quicker for me to adjust. The downside of a level leader is that it doesn't cast great. It's definitely not going to give you beautiful loops and it's not going to give you the prettiest presentation. It is a little bit of a flop. And so that's the downside of it. But typically what I do is I actually make my own level leaders. So from my floating line, I basically will make a perfection loop with 20 pounds of mono, and I use Maxima Chameleon because it's relatively stiff. So it actually has pretty good turnover. And then I will blood knot it to 15 pounds of Maxima Chameleon. And I'm just using 12 inches. So that makes my butt section, which is 24 inches. And then I will clinch knot that to a tippet ring. And the tippet ring just allows me to make quicker changes to my rig if I get tangled or get caught up or break off. And then the main section is just going to be about 5 to 7 feet of 3X mono. And like I said, that's usually where I put the strike indicator in this section. And then at the very end, I'll put on my nymph. And 3X, you could use 2X, you could use 1X, you could use 5X. I think it all depends on your casting style. If you're a great caster, you can go really thin. If you're a poor caster like me, you may want to go a little thicker, 3X or 2X. It'll turn over a little easier. This slide just shows an option number 2. So let's say it's basically the same up until this little section, the last little bit. So for instance, if you feel like you need to go with a thinner tippet to your fly because maybe the fish are spooky and you want a slightly thinner tippet, you can run 3X through the level section and then do a blood knot or a surgeon's knot and put on 4X or 5X tippet to your fly. And it will still work really well there.
Jenn, can you just talk a little bit about, you already mentioned it, but why you use the tippet ring?
Yeah, so I know tippet rings can be controversial. Everyone certainly has their own opinion about them. I use tippet rings because, like I said, it's easier for me to make changes to my rig with a tippet ring. So it's easier to make put on, like for instance, let's say I get tangled really badly, which definitely happens every 10 casts, and then I have to redo my whole rig. Well, instead of having to break out another mono section and blood knot it, I can just cut the section, the clinch knot to the tippet ring, and then tie on another section of 3X. So it maybe takes my re-rigging and retying from something that might take 6 or 7 minutes to 2 minutes. So I can get back faster. I personally don't think that it affects my presentation. It may hint when you're casting, it definitely kind of hinges potentially a little bit more. So it does affect your casting. But when it hits the water, I'm using basically a medium tippet ring, and I don't actually think it makes that much more of a splash than the 15-pound mono or the fly line. So I personally don't believe it really affects the presentation that much. And honestly, it's kind of the same. If I'm using a strike indicator, it usually means that I'm fishing something between 3 to 6 feet deep. And so you have the advantage of having that degree, a large depth to kind of hide any splashes that you might make with your casting or lay down of your rig.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Alaska trout techniques. You know, Alaska is seen as kind of like the fly fishing destination, one of the more popular ones in the world. In a summer, we'll have on average 2 million tourists come up here. And fishing is probably one of the most popular things that people like to do, outdoor recreation. And, you know, we have pretty pristine rivers. We have not a lot of development on them as far as dams and that sort of thing. So we have, you know, natural wild rainbows that a lot of places, you know, stock their fish. And Alaska has, you know, a stronghold of actually native fish. And the trout here, you know, they, because of the cold water and the amount of food that is available to them, the trout in Alaska actually grow slower and live longer than trout like in the lower 48. One interesting thing that I read recently was that most trout in North America will only live to be about 6 or 7 years old, but trout in Alaska can live to 10 years. In the Kvichak River, they estimate a lot of the trout there to be 14 years old. So that's almost twice as long and twice as much time to grow big as the trout in the lower 48. So, you know, it's a fly fishing destination, but I think a lot of people are intimidated or think they have to do something different than what they're used to when they come to Alaska. And I like to tell people when they call to book trips that, you know, you don't need to cast like Brad Pitt and a river runs through it to be able to catch fish. And a lot of the techniques that we use up here are, you know, the same as other places. And I've, you know, done the opposite where, you know, I learned certain techniques in Alaska, and then, you know, I was down on the White River in Arkansas and nobody was like swinging two-handed rods, but I decided to give that a try and had a lot of success with it. So it's not, you know, it's fun to experiment and try different things. But what I wanted to talk about specifically today was just different techniques that we use here in Alaska and how you can apply that to maybe where you live, or if you're planning to come to Alaska, you can try some of these. So like anywhere, you want to be able to match the hatch. Well, what does that mean in Alaska? So you need to know, you know, what's going on as far as like bugs and when they're, you know, starting to come out, and primarily within rivers that have salmon, you know, you need to know where the salmon are in their life cycle, because rainbow trout in the wild will feed on the salmon as eggs, as alevin, as fry, as smelt, and then later after the salmon have spawned and start to decompose, the trout will actually eat the flesh that is coming off the dying salmon. But in addition to that, they'll eat, you know, all sorts of bugs, sculpins, leeches. We have freshwater eels, freshwater shrimp, and then they'll even eat mice and small rodents that are unlucky enough to fall into the rivers. So there's a lot of food available to them constantly, and they don't have to work very hard to eat. So you're not, you know, digging in your fly box trying to find, you know, a size 16 whatever, because that's what the trout are only hitting that day. They aren't as picky as trout are in other areas because of that. And then sometimes imitating those different techniques will require you to rig your rod up differently. So that's what we're going to go into here. This is just kind of a general guidance. Obviously, people have their own preference of, you know, how they do things, but it's a good, it'll give you a good idea of fishing up here. So dry fly fishing, I think it's funny, like one of the first things that somebody told me when I came to Alaska was that, you know, a lot of people don't dry fly fish here, which it was like, well, why not? So in a lot of, smaller creeks, and there's, a lot of clear water that you can see fish. But then even in big rivers like the Kenai, you'll see trout hitting the surface in the eddies and riffles. And, that's a good indication that a dry fly, you'll have some success with it. So the ideal rod for, smaller water and a lighter current would be an 8.5 to 9 foot rod. And you would want it to be a 5 or 6 weight just because of the heavier currents. A lot of the fishing in Alaska, when you think of like the weight rod that you need, it's not just for the fish that you're fighting. It's also like the Kenai it has a super strong current. So you have to factor that into the weight of the rod that you use. So you definitely want to go heavier, because once you get a fish on, that current is going to start taking the fish down river. So you're not only fighting the fish to get it back up to you, you're fighting that current too. So the setup for dry fly fishing would be just a normal weight forward floating line to a 9 foot tapered leader. I just get the prepackaged Rio Power Flex Trout tapered leaders. They're easy. And then you can go thicker for bigger dry flies, but some things that I like to use are like stimulators, green drakes, parachute atoms, elk hair caddis, and you can go as small as 16 and as big as 8. So for the method of dry fly fishing, I think dry fly fishing is kind of one of the most popular techniques that a lot of people know and think of when they think of fly fishing. Like I said before, this is ideal for like smaller streams or the eddies of bigger rivers, or the riffles during warmer weather. And it can be a great like in-between sort of technique to use if, the salmon haven't started to spawn yet, and, like the, smaller salmon have gone out to the ocean and they're out of the rivers. Dry fly fishing can be great, especially if it's warmer. And then, like I said, seeing them hit the surface is a pretty good indication that it'll work if you put it on. So that's what the setup looks like for a dry fly rig. You just have your regular floating fly line for your connection, a loop to loop, which is kind of what I use on most of my rigs. Is easy. And then your tapered leader there, anywhere from 7.5 feet to 15 feet. And then tie that to your dry fly. One thing I also wanted to mention about the dry flies is that because, like I said, the fish aren't as picky about what they're eating, you can get away with using like larger generic flies. So just wanted to mention that. And then make sure you check the regulations of where you intend to fish for a lot of reasons. But Alaska is very regulated as far as fishing goes. Like for the Kenai, in order to guide, you actually have to take a class for a week in order to learn all of the regulations and all of the different agencies who manage it, because it is so complicated. So you always want to make sure you check it. A lot of water is single hook only. So if you use like a hopper dropper setup, that would actually be illegal because you're only allowed one fly. And then mice. So you might have heard of mousing. And and it's becoming a pretty popular way to catch fish. The ideal setup for that would be a 9-foot 5 or 6 weight. Again, it would be a regular floating line to a heavier tapered leader than a regular dry fly setup. You want to be able to turn over the mouse pattern. And then some popular mouse patterns are a Moorish mouse or the mouse rat. So the trout in Alaska are well known for being carnivorous. They'll eat mice, voles, shrews. You know, when they like catch some of them for research, they'll cut open their stomachs and find a couple mice in there, which is just crazy to me to think of a trout actually eating a mouse. But you want to think of it as you're casting like a giant dry fly. So it's basically a piece of foam and yeah, so it'll float on top of the water like a dry fly. And then you can skate it, swing it across, or skitter it. You know, if you take the end of your rod tip and kind of go like this to make it look like it's struggling like a mouse would if it had fallen in the water. And the rainbows will hit them pretty violently, but it's definitely a very fun way to catch them. Someone caught a trout with a baby duck in his mouth. That's crazy. Yeah, so this is the setup for a mouse. And you would just have the floating fly line to a mono leader about 3 to 5 feet, and then your mouse pattern there. But yeah, it's definitely becoming a very popular method, and it's a lot of fun. So there's a rainbow with a mouse. All right, and then beads. So beads, and then also we're going to talk about dead drifting flesh flies in this section too, because it's a very similar method for both. So it's ideal for, the ideal rod for smaller water would be like a 10-foot 4 to 6 weight. For bigger rivers and heavier current, you would want the 10-foot rod, but in a 6 to 8 weight. For line setup, you know, fly lines like the Rio Extreme Indicator or the Scientific Angler's Anadro Indicator, they help you turn over the weight, but it's also painted like orange on the last part of it. So it's kind of like an added visual to see when something hits your fly. And you have to turn over, you know, sometimes quite a bit of weight to get those down. Kind of like Jenn had touched on with nymphing, you're going to use split shot with this. So you're going to want a line that can cast that, or at least, you know, get it out there. And then taper leaders work, but custom fluorocarbon leaders will tend to get down faster, which Jenn also touched on. So beads, like you guys saw in that second to first picture of the trout with its mouth full of eggs, it's the trout will, you know, sit right behind the salmon as they start to spawn and just engorge themselves on their eggs. So a lot of times you'll catch trout and they'll just be stuffed, and they, you know, their stomachs are like round. They look like little footballs, but they'll start like puking up eggs because they're so full of them. They can't like swallow another one. So for the beads, they're not really flies, but they come in different millimeter sizes. So there's 6, 8, 10, and 12 are the more popular ones. And then they come in probably 50 to 100 different colors, but they're meant to match different stages, from like the fresh egg that just came out of a salmon to like a dead egg that has been sitting in the water for a while and has lost some of its color. And then we have 5 different species of Pacific salmon, and each one has different size eggs. So that's what the different sizes are meant to imitate. And then it's kind of a similar thing for the flesh flies. You know, we have like micro flesh, we call it, like little pieces of flesh. There's articulated, which, you know, just moves because it's 2 parts. And then talking about colors, white to cream, and then oranges and reds. So like the beads, it's meant to imitate salmon flesh in the water. Like a lot of times when, if you're fishing at like the Russian River, people are catching sockeye and cleaning them right there in the water, and the trout are coming and getting, you know, the fresh flesh from the salmon that were just caught. So it'll be like a bright orange or red. And if you throw a fly that is that color, then the trout think it's part of that salmon. And then later in the fall, when they start to decompose and fall apart, you're going to have, you know, more of like a lighter tan white color as the flesh has been in the water longer. So beads are extremely effective. A lot of people, you know, don't like beads. A lot of people love beads, so take your pick, but you can't deny how effective they are, especially once the salmon are spawning. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of salmon all spawning at once, so the river is just full of eggs, and the trout are just in a feeding frenzy. And if you throw a bead in there that looks like one of them, then you're likely to catch quite a few fish. And then, like we talked about with the flesh flies, that's what that second part is talking about. And then we talked about what they're meant to look at. So to utilize this method, you'll run your leader to a tippet ring, like we were just talking about with the nymphs, a swivel or a blood knot. I prefer the knots. And from this connection, you would add another 18 inches of tippet, which we'll see an example of when we get to the graphic there. So depending on the current of the river, you're going to want anywhere from usually 1 to 3 split shot. If there's a slow current and it's, you know, pretty shallow, you could probably get away with 1, but you'll just have to adjust accordingly. I've, you know, fished some parts of the river when it's like the middle of summer and just cranking, and you need like 8 split shot on there, and you can't even cast it, and you just space yourself away from everyone in case you hit them with the weight. It's not very fun. So there you would have like your floating fly line to your tapered leader, and then your strike indicator at the top up there. And so then you would run the leader about 9 to 10 feet down to your weight. I like to put that knot there where the X is, and then run another 12 to 18 inches of tippet from that you put the bead on. And then you can put the, you can either tie a nail knot underneath the bead to keep it from sliding, or you can peg it with, they're called trout pegs. They're little like plastic things that you shove in there that keep them from sliding, or toothpicks, like wooden toothpicks work well too. And the reason I like doing that extra tippet separate from the leader and having that knot in there is that it's a good breakaway point. If you do get snagged on something, it'll break at that knot instead of losing your whole setup. So you still have your weights and everything. You'll just lose that little part. A lot of times, you know, the Kenai especially is pretty like rocky and gravel bottom, so you don't get snagged on a lot of things. But if you're like drifting in the boat, it's just a nice thing to have it. If you get stuck, you don't have to row back upstream. It'll just break off at that knot. And then this is the flesh fly setup. So you have your floating line to your mono leader, and it's about 4 to 6 feet. And then again, in this sort of setup, you could also put an indicator in order to dead drift it. So when it comes to beads, make sure you know the regulations. Like in Alaska, the beads have to be free sliding, or they cannot be fixed more than 2 inches from the hook. Oh, and then there is a question about the bead diagram. Yes, so it's just a hook underneath the bead. It's not actually attached to the bead.
That means world domination.
So then nymphs and bugs. I think Jenn did a really good job of talking about nymphs and bugs and the setup for that. Up here, the ideal rod for smaller streams, again, would be like a 10-foot 4 to 6 weight. And then larger rivers, a 10-foot 7 or 8 weight. For your line, you'd want a nymphing or indicator line, again, like the extreme indicator or the anadromous lines. And so as far as flies go, generics such as pheasant tails, hare's ears, prince nymphs, in sizes 8 to 14. You can also use jig nymphs, check nymphs, and any other popular patterns. So the nymphing setup is, like I said, very similar to the bead setup, and I think Jenn's explanation of nymph fishing, especially under an indicator, was a lot of good information and could be applied to how you would do it for Alaska too. So here we have like what a double nymph rig would look like, with the floating fly line to an indicator, your leader. And then if you were doing like a hopper dropper style, it would be your point fly to tippet and then your dropper fly. And then again, like Jenn said, a good rule of thumb for your indicator is to have it fixed at 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the water you're fishing and adjust as necessary. So then streamers. The ideal rod would be a 9.5 foot, or sorry, 9 foot 5 or 6 weight. And then larger rivers, 9 foot 7 or 8 weight. Your line setup would be a typical weight forward streamer line. Floating lines the most popular, but there are some instances where sinking lines or sink tips will get the job done, especially if you're planning to fish lakes. So popular flies are woolly buggers, Zudler minnows, leech patterns, sculpin patterns, and articulated flesh flies. So they can be swung on a tight line just without any sort of indicator. They can be dead drifted under an indicator, or you can even cast it out as far as you can and just strip it back in like you would, you know, saltwater fishing. And then this is what a streamer leader setup would look like. And you can also use dumbbell eye flies or add split shot for more weight. I think this is the last method, but swinging could be its own, entire presentation. It's hard to, briefly describe. But the ideal rod for swinging or, skagit casting, spey casting, whatever you want to call it, for big rivers would be a 13-foot 6 or 7 weight. Smaller rivers, you could do like an under 11-foot 4 or 5 weight switch rod. You can also do single hand swinging with as small as like a 9-foot 4 weight. And, pretty much any single hand or two-handed rod will work. Line setup, you can do Skagit, Scandi, mid-belly, long belly. Again, that's probably confusing if you don't know anything about swinging flies, but it is a lot of fun to do, so I wanted to make sure to mention it. So some flies, my partner Dave, he has a YouTube channel and ties a lot of swinging flies, so he wanted me to make sure I put in one of his flies, the panic button. And then trout space sculpins, and then smaller variations of like typical steelhead flies work really well. When the salmon are starting to die off, you can also swing some of the flesh fly patterns. And then the method to swing flies, you will methodically, cast and then let the fly swing downriver from you. And then you step down after every swing so you can cover a lot of water. And this method helps show your fly to as many eager trout as possible in a given run. So that's kind of what a trout space setup would look like. And then just wanted to touch on keepfishwet.org. I can't say enough good things about that organization. So in Alaska, everything, the trout are all catch and release. Like in the Kenai, you can only keep one trout under 16 inches, but nobody really keeps the trout. So with the catch and release fishery, you're sharing those fish with everybody else who fishes that river, and you want to make sure that you're handling your fish like you would want the person who caught that fish before you to handle it. A lot of fish look like they chewed on glass. Their mouths are all ripped up and they're missing eyes and mandibles and all sorts of things. So we just want to make sure that we're, taking care of the fish and making them the priority over pictures or, whatever else. But keepfishwet.org has a lot of good information on like the science behind a lot of like the why. So yeah, check that out if you haven't yet, because it's a great resource. And then enjoy the journey. Have fun with it.
Awesome. We'll do a Q&A here shortly, but I just, again, wanted to personally say thank you from me personally, as well as United Women on the Fly team and community, just to all three of you for just such a great presentation and your knowledge and your time and just being a part of this. It's amazing. So thank you three so very, very much. And I know, as some said, as a new angler, that their minds just blown right now because there is so much information, and just enjoy this learning journey. Everyone has questions, everyone's learning, and maybe come back to this in a year after you have some experience, or you've learned something. You might be like, oh, I totally get that leader diagram now. So let's just kind of open it up to questions. So you can feel free to use a chat, or we love seeing your faces and hearing your voices as well. So we can do that also. Any questions that were not quite answered? The chat too, if you're uncomfortable. Hi, Evelyn. Yeah.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I thought it was very well done, and everybody's information was really very good. And I like the way that Jackie would say, well, Jenn said this, so you know more. So it really added to the whole thing. It's very good. Thank you, girls.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I've got a question. This is Dana Williams from Texas Women Fly Fishers. I haven't seen the whole, I guess, pegged egg or the bead thing with the hook before. I've heard about it, but I've never really looked into it. It's not really done down here. But is that only happening in areas with salmon, or would that be in other parts of the country as well that people might use that kind of technique?
You want to answer that, Jackie, or?
Yeah, Jackie or anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm not really sure, I know with the regulations in Alaska, they want it to be, free sliding, or it has to be fixed, about 2 inches away from it. And I think that's just, to give the trout more of a chance, I guess. So, if you don't want it sliding all over on your leader, it's just a good way to keep it in place, so it's not so it's always down on the bottom where the trout would see it. But
Jackie, let me clarify. I've never seen anyone use beads down here in Texas on the Guadalupe for trout. So I mean more of the bead in general rather than, locking it into place or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, I guess.
Are those used in other parts of the country? But I've only been fishing for about 4 years, so maybe I've missed it. But I just wondered if, is it only in areas where there's salmon around and they're trying to, you talked about flesh and eggs and that kind of thing, or?
I'm not really sure. I guess I haven't fished one anywhere else, but I think in the Great Lakes and stuff, or steelhead, people will use the bigger beads I've seen. And I know in some places they're banned and you can't even use them. So I guess it would just depend on the area that you're in.
And I can help answer that too, Dana. Yeah, a lot of it's just looking at your local reservations. Oh my gosh, regulations to know. But there are some places, some anglers, that do choose to use a bead if it is legal. And just again knowing those regulations and how long or the distance from that hook to the bead, that's really significant. But as far as, some steelheaders will do that. I know, me living in the Pacific Northwest, some of the Eastern Washington rivers, as well as some of the kind of winter steelhead rivers too, kind of along the Pacific Northwest coastline. So yeah, there are different fisheries. I believe maybe even some people use yellow beads for whitefish spawn. So it's all kind of, dependent upon, what the regulations are, as well as, what is ethical. So that's just, so it's kind of all in all, there's a lot of, differences, or just, yeah. So yes, they can be fished, but I think, again, just look at the regulations to make sure that it's legal to do so. Does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I just didn't really understand why the bead versus, of course we use egg patterns all the time for flies, but I guess it sounds like it's more deadly or something.
Yeah, you're just matching the hatch. I know, certain fisheries, kind of those yarnies, are actually better. They work better than the actual beads. So again, it's all dependent on the fisheries and what's going to work better. So, awesome.
Thank you, thanks, lady.
I would like to say something about the beads too. When stretch of water, people use beads a lot. Guess what? The trout will learn the pattern. They even know or remember the color, and they won't take it. So sometimes I go back to yarn egg, and it's really effective. So it all depends on the water, the time of the year, and what you're trying to target on. But certain things will be more effective than the other.
Awesome.
And also, I cannot, during the presentation, I don't know if I expressed enough that to those who are just starting to fly fish or, trout fishing, stealth is number one important key. For me, it took me a year to understand the importance of it. After fishing for a year, I got the rig down, I know the fly, I do my homework and I study, and I cannot catch a single trout. Why? You know, I show up to the water and I get so excited and I got the perfect drift, but the trouts aren't there because, you know, they see me. So it's very important.
I've been sneaking around all weekend, and actually my girlfriend just, when we were on our hands and knees army crawling through, she completely got stung by stinging nettles. So yeah, so I can't say though how much being a kind of that stealth approach is so big. Just being quiet and not or don't just rush through a piece of water. And because sometimes it's just that observation, and what I've found, you know, is just to watch, and you'll start seeing fish and you can actually start to sight fish to them. So that stealth approach is huge. It's, yeah, for any type of fishing, truly. Cool. What other questions?
I'm calling from Minnesota, but I was curious about the Alaska fishing and the mice. Do they trout chase mice all times a day, or is it more of a night or evening fishing?
So I know like in some places I've seen people like down in Arkansas or like in Idaho, people do it at night, like on golf courses and stuff with the mice. But in Alaska, we can do it any time of the day. I've never done it at night. It doesn't really get dark in the summer, so it's mostly just when it's like warm enough, like the hottest parts of the summer, that it's really effective.
Yeah, it's in the Brule in Wisconsin. It's a night fishing exercise, so not as much fun. I'd rather fish during light usually.
Cool. There was was it mentioned why beads are tied 2 inches up from the hook? Is there a reason, kind of, I know regulations, Jackie, but is it also to make sure that the fish, there's a certain distance that if the fish eats it, it might fully swallow it, and 2 inches is probably good? Or is there, do you know with the distance?
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact reason,
Okay.
but I can look into it and let you know.
Awesome. And there was another question too about spay versus a switch rod. And truly, like, a switch rod is going to be a lighter rod. A lot of people will use a switch rod to try to do a 2-handed cast, but also to nymph with it. And usually with a spay rod, they're usually longer, they're usually heavier, they have a longer butt section. So it's not necessarily, I mean, I have seen people nymph with a spay rod, but that's not, usually it's just those 2-handed casts. So that's kind of the difference. And if you were to research or look on the internet, like different, the difference, if you just typed in the difference, what's the difference between a switch and a spay rod? There's a ton of articles that have been written out about it, but truly it's like weight. And if you're going to be trying to do a 2-handed cast and also nymph, then a switch rod is ideal. So, cool. What, any other questions before we take off? And awesome. All right. Well, thank you all again. Thank you, Anh and Jenn and Jackie. You guys are amazing. And I can't, from myself personally and through the community of United Way on the Fly, thank you 3 for just sharing your knowledge and your time, and just allowing us to hear all your awesome knowledge and education. And this recording will be posted in about a week. Tomorrow, there'll be a blog post for Tuesday tips on with all of Jenn's information. You can go back to the blog. For those that don't know, United Way on the Fly does have a website. It's UWOTF.com, and we have all of our blogs on there. You can click on blog and click on education, and there's just a slew of information. So that's on there as well. And Jackie's, her Alaska stuff will be the last 2 weeks of June. So you'll be seeing a lot of that with the blog post. And then An's has already been posted, but please feel free to just go back and look at her blog as well, or look at social media. And if you look at the hashtag UWOTF education, you can follow that hashtag and look it up. All of our educational posts are tagged with that. So it's a great way to kind of find all of that information. So again, thank you guys so much. And thank you to everyone who joined and the community, and y'all rock. So thank you. Good night.